The first house I can remember ever having any unusual experiences was a shop that I lived in with my parents prior to my marriage. It was a fairly old shop. I used to sit on the stairs in the hallway when my fiancé used to phone me up, and I can remember feeling a cold draft coming down the stairs, and on that cold draft there would be the smell of perfume. Apparently a lady had actually committed suicide in the house, and I'm pretty convinced that it was her perfume I could smell. It certainly wasn't any perfume that we wore.
About 5-6 years ago I used to go to Napier University in Edinburgh, and I had to go between Glasgow and Edinburgh every day, so me and my sister bought this car. So we used to use a lot of wee tiny roads. There's loads of them between tiny little villages between Glasgow and Edinburgh. There's one stretch of road, it's really wild, and all there is this old church. And when you go through there during the daytime, it's quite spooky, because you can see through the windows, it's stained glass windows at the front. You can see straight out through the back, through the stained glass windows at the back. It sits on a bit of a hill, and you can see all the gravestones standing up. One night, we'd gone out in Edinburgh, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, we're coming back. Going quite fast, radio blaring, we're all singing along. Next thing is, I sees this wee face at the window. It was like a little child hanging on at the outside of the car. Now I thought, it's my reflection at first, and I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, am I a bit drunk here, yeah? So I thought, this is not right. So I sat up, got in the middle of the car, thought, I'll keep far away from it. It was hanging on. We were doing about 60, 70 miles an hour. My sister and my friend in the front seat, I says to them, there's somebody looking in the back window. They two are going, don't scare us, don't tell us, we don't want to know. I'm saying, would you just look? I think it's my imagination, I think I've flipped here, but somebody please look and back me up. Two of them looked round, both of them saw it, and we just stepped on the gas. Away we went. It hung on for a couple of miles, and it was outside that old church with the old gravestones. Now, to this day, it'd be interesting to know if somebody got knocked down on that road, whether somebody had ran out and hit the side of a car, but it was hanging on for a good couple of miles.
I remember a tale I was told a short while ago by my mother. My father died when I was 6 years old, and it was a case of, prior to that, my mother and father slept in the front room, my sister and I were in the back room at the back of the house. A few days after he died, my mum she told me, was going to bed, went to sleep, turned over in the bed with the lights off as normal. When she was aware of the door opening, somebody walking in, getting into bed with her, turning on the side, the pressure going down on the mattress and saying, don't worry, everything will be all right. At this, my mum promptly turns around, looks all over her with the lights on, recognising my father's voice. Straight out of the room, what was that? Of course, there was nobody there. And ever since that, to this day, she's always kept the bedside light on, 20 years later.
It's a true story, and it was told to me by a friend who I worked with during the war whilst I was in the WAFs. She lived in London and had 2 little daughters. Her husband was abroad in the army. Janet and the 2 little girls were lying in bed, and I suppose the bed was facing, because a lot of rooms years ago had old-fashioned fireplaces in. And they lying in bed, and she said his face, they must have been looking at the fireplace sort of thing as they were lying there, and his face just appeared. It just seemed to come into the fireplace. Shortly after that, she heard, I suppose from the War Office, her husband had been killed in action.
A friend of mine told me only a couple of months ago that he had a strange experience when he was young. And it was when he was about 4 years old, apparently. He was living down in Devon, and he and his family lived in a very old farmhouse. And apparently one night he was sent to bed with a temperature. He wasn't feeling very well at all. His mum had sent him to bed early. And during the night he got worse and worse. He couldn't sleep, and his throat hurt a lot. And he started really panicking, and he couldn't call for his mum because he lost his voice. And it was getting later and later, and like I say, he was getting more and more worried when the door to his bedroom opened and a woman walked in. And he didn't recognise this woman at all. He said it was a very old woman. And she walked over to him and sat on his bed. And she said, "Don't worry, I'm a friend of the family and I've come to make sure that you're going to be okay." And he sort of calmed down, thinking that his mum had sent somebody up to see him. Maybe she was a nurse or a doctor or something like that. But she was very old, so he was a bit confused about it. Anyway, she said, "Right, I'm going to get you something, but don't worry, don't panic. You're going to be fine." She walked out of the room. 5 minutes later, she came back in carrying a big earthenware pot. The sort of pot that you get beer and cider in with a big cork stopper. And she poured some of this, whatever was in the pot, some liquid, into a cup and gave it to him. And she said, "Drink this and you'll be fine." And he drank it. He remembers putting the glass back down on the table next to his bed, lying back in bed, and then the next thing he remembered, he woke up in the morning and his mum was next to him. And he said, "Wow, who was that woman that you sent up last night? Because whatever it was that was in the pot really worked and I feel a load better." I mean, he could talk, his throat had gone down, his temperature had gone down and everything. And his mum didn't know who he was talking about. And she said, "I've no idea. I didn't send anybody up. You must have been dreaming." And he said, "No, because there's her pot." And the pot was next to his bed.
My dad was telling us the next day, he woke up one middle of the one night, and the reason he woke up was my mum was walking round at the bottom of the bed in a circle, and her eyes were shut and she was asleep, and she was walking around in a circle, and Dad says that she was actually, like, her feet were moving as if she was going up steps, and she was walking round and round and round. And my dad got out of bed and he thought, something really wrong here, she's sleepwalking, something's disturbing her. And as he went towards her, she slumped against the dresser and put her hand up in the air as if reaching out to something. And Dad grabbed her and woke her up. And she goes, leave me, I'm going to my dad, I've seen my dad." Her dad, she said, she's telling my dad, that her dad was walking round on a spiral staircase and he was going up towards the roof. And her dad used to work as a railway worker, and he always wore like Doc Marten heavy boots. And he had them in his shoelaces over his shoulder, and he was walking in his socks. And she says, he's not at work, he's here, I can talk to him, he's not busy. And she was following him. She says, "I was following him round the stairs. He wouldn't let me come." She says, he said, "I'm all right. You stay there. You stay where you are." And she was leaning out to him and she wanted to go with her dad. And my dad woke her as she was going to go with her dad.
I was married and we had our own little cottage, which at the time we bought it was exactly 100 years old. I sat in the lounge with my second child, who would have been about 9 months old, on my lap, and all of a sudden he shot bolt upright on my lap. He was rigid, he was staring at the door, his eyes were really wide, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck going up, and I felt very cold and very, very nervous. I couldn't see anything, but he obviously could, and of course at that age he was much too young to tell me what it was he could see. I always felt that there was something about the cottage. My eldest son would often tell me about a grey lady who would come out of the wall and sit on the bed, on the end of the bed, and talk to him. He said that she was kind, she would talk to him. He certainly wasn't frightened of her. The lady who lived in the house years before was very small and very frail, and the next door neighbour told us that one day they hadn't seen her and they were quite concerned about her. And apparently she'd fallen out of bed, got tangled in her bedclothes, and was laying pretty well concealed under the bed when he found her. She was obviously taken to hospital, and she did die at some point later in hospital. We actually lived in the house for 6 years, and apart from the 1 or 2 experiences I've mentioned, had no problems at all. We were very happy there. The people who we bought the house off also had children, and they seemed very happy there. But ever since we have left, the people who have bought the house have been either retired people or people without children. and have never stayed very long at all.
It's always being advertised in the newspapers, isn't it?
Yes.
It's always.
Yes.
Perhaps this lady wants, perhaps
She likes children.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
When I was a kid, trying to get to sleep, I used to be lying in my bed. The bedroom at home is like 27 feet long, and I share it with my sister. And she sleeps at one end of it, and I sleep at the other end, so we're quite a distance apart. And there is walled units in. So my headboard of my bed where I sleep is in like sort of an alcove. And I used to hear breathing, like somebody's sleeping next to me in the bed, and it was a single bed. And as a kid, I'd hear this breathing, I thought somebody's sleeping there, and I'd get a bit frightened. So I would speed my breathing up to see if the breathing was still the same. I would actually hold my breath, thinking, well, it's maybe a bit of an air or a bit of me moving in the bed creaking, it could be that. I remember telling my sister once, and she just didn't want to know and was really scared and was like telling me off for scaring her. But I got used to it because it was there for years and years, and I never thought in really of it until I moved out at home. And I was sleeping in another bed, and I thought, there's no breathing in this bed here, so it's something about that bed at home, or where it's situated. And I remember one night I really frightened my sister because I got up out of bed and I must have been semi-asleep, went all the way across the room and climbed in the bed with her and said to her, I can't sleep there, the breathing's keeping me awake. And we were two really scared. I remember crying, like we two crying, cuddled up crying in the bed. And it wasn't until I went back home again at Christmas, I haven't been home in about 4 or 5 years, went home, sleeping in that bed and the breathing's still there.
It was about 3 years ago now, probably, and I was at my boyfriend's house. I think we'd been out somewhere, and it was probably about 2 a.m. that we'd gone to bed, so it was pitch black. And I remember actually going to bed and trying to get to sleep and feeling sort of restless and a bit weird. And I opened my eyes and I realised that I couldn't see anything at all. And I remember turning over and trying to get to sleep. And just as I'd settled down, I heard a voice right next to my ear, and it sounded like there were other voices underneath, and I couldn't make out anything that was being said because it sounded like it was in a foreign language, and I was petrified, completely petrified, and I jumped out of bed, ran into Mike's bed, but wouldn't tell him what had happened because I thought he'd just think I was mad. So I didn't tell him anything at all about that incident for a good couple of years afterwards, when one day I was sat with a load of friends in a cafe and we were all talking about weird experiences, and I just happened to say that, and Mike was there. He overheard me talking about it and he said, oh, I've had that sort of experience in the same room, only I was alone. I think it was in broad daylight. He was reading a book and he heard someone say Mike, his name, a male voice, again very low voice, speak his name right next to his ear. And there was absolutely no explanation for it whatsoever. Nobody else was in the room. Nobody else was in the house. And we still don't know what it was.
This was while I was in the WAFs. I was asleep in bed, and there were lots of beds all right close to one another. Each girl had a little space between, but you've got a lot of beds, a lot of girls in the room, perhaps 30 or 40. And I must have been dreaming, see, and it seemed as though somebody scraped their foot, rubbing their feet on the little mat that I'd got the side of my bed, and they got in bed behind me. And somehow it woke me up, and I was sort of petrified, and I lay there and I daren't move and I daren't do anything. And then I realised that my single bed, there wasn't room for anyone else to get in behind me, because we had our blankets all tucked in, so they couldn't have got in. And eventually I put my hand behind me, and of course there was no one there. I think I was asleep and it was a dream, but it was a very vivid dream, because there was no one there.